Hi everyone, welcome to this week's lecture. We're joined again by Stephen Threadgold. This week is on figures of youth, and this is a really important concept in youth studies that Steve has developed, and it's been quite widely used in the time since you wrote the paper that's set for this week's reading. So, in the first part of the lecture, we will take you through defining the concept, and the approach. And it really does underpin the, I guess, broad approach to youth sociology and youth studies that we bring in this course and in all of the sociology of youth courses in at the University of Newcastle. It's very much connected to the definitions and, I guess, perspectives we talked about previously in the course too. And then we'll move on to part two, which is around how these figures of young people or youth can be seen, I guess, in contemporary life related to capitalism and in political and temporal figures. And then in part three, we'll discuss risky figures and youth studies figures in particular. So, yeah, really grateful to have Steve along, who has written this work, to be able to tell us more about it and to define it properly. So, yeah, thanks, Steve.
No worries. Thanks for having me on.
So, I guess the concept is about trying to theorize the state of young people today, as well as sort of how they're sort of positioned or what kind of work they do for us in narratives of young people's lives and
Yeah.
sort of how they're positioned. Is that right?
Yeah, I suppose when I wrote this paper a while ago now, I think it came out in 2018 or 20, I'm not sure. But I was finishing writing the book on hipsters and bogans that I was writing about, how those are kind of figures of class relations and how hipsters are kind of middle class and bogans are kind of working class and the different work that does in the media or whatever and politics. And I'd been thinking about kind of youth as a kind of version of that for a long time, but hadn't really written about it in any depth. And like, from a sociological point of view, broad stereotypes are interesting. And something like hipsters and bogans are pretty straightforward ones, where something like youth, though, is much less straightforward. Youth or young people means a lot of different things to different people in different times and places and spaces. And so I wanted to try and reckon with that. And I reckon one of the things that I also wanted to do is in our own field of youth studies, I think we use the term ourselves differently in different work we're doing. And often then when we're talking to each other or having debates or whatever, we're actually talking about different things, not really talking about the same thing, even though we're using the term youth or young person. So the paper was a kind of way to think about that, to help position different definitions or figures of youth and how they're used in different ways across those different spaces. And um, yeah, because I think, yeah, young people, the term youth and young person can mean very different things depending on who's saying it and why.
Yeah, so it's like it's a laden term, so it doesn't just rely or relate to a particular period of a person's life.
Hmm.
You know, when
Yeah.
you say youth, there's a whole lot of associations with that, right? That you just you bring to it, or we all do because of what we know about the world at the moment and the kind of particular time and place we're in.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so what I'm doing here, particularly and specifically, I suppose, is talking about the very political ways youth is used in different contexts. So I was influenced by Imogen Tyler's work on her amazing book called Revolting Subjects, where she talks about different kind of stereotypes and figurative stereotypes in the UK. Um, and I kind of then kind of imported that to think about that, using it as a methodology to think about different ways that young people are used in different sections of society, whether it's political or media or in, psychology or sociology as well. Um, and so it allows us then, I think, to kind of have a bit more clarity, I think, when using the term. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah,
Yeah. And I
yeah.
guess to be
So,
more critical about it as well. That's what it helps us to
yeah,
see.
yeah, not even just to be critical, just kind of realize we're doing it. I mean, if you go
Yeah,
to
that's what I mean.
conferences, sometimes, we like. I get the impression sometimes that in the question times in sessions, like we're often talking about very different things when we're talking about young people now, whether that's a different cohort of young people. But I think more importantly than that, there's a kind of ontological thing that happens.
Mm.
where sometimes someone might be talking about the representation of young people, another person might be talking about an actual young person that they know, another person might be about someone that they interviewed in their research project, a youth worker might be talking about a client. All these things are very different, but they kind of get mushed together when we start talking about young people as a whole.
Mm,
And then when you start to take in the different disciplinary kind of orientations and concepts around, around young people, around things in general, even then when you start thinking about a young person that's filled out a survey to one that's like you've interviewed or done a workshop with, we're finding out in our own work at the moment, like some stuff in the fintech thing, right, where people say that they use a particular kind of fintech, but they've used it once a year ago. When we talk to them in person for an hour, it's a very different picture, and so that image or impression of the young person
mm.
is that comes out of those different methods is going to be different.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm particularly interested, I think, as we've touched on, you would have touched on the course already, the way that then young people or youth is put to work politically, particularly around moral panics,
Mhm.
particularly around kind of blaming them and scapegoating them for things that they actually have no real control over, often individualizing broader social problems and really trying to ignore the actual structural or institutional reasons um, why there are various problems. So I think um, by using this figurative method, we can draw out the different kind of scapegoating and different blamings of young people for
Mm.
things that they have no control over. And then, yeah, just very broadly, the different ways they're used over space and time.
Yeah. And yeah, I guess there's so many different associations with that as well. Like it's not just an objective thing. It does so much work,
Mm.
as you say, and often that work is not acknowledged at all. So there tends to be young people tend to be sort of as a category used to inherently mean concern, objective
Yeah,
concern, or
yeah,
something that is inherently like needs either protection or to
fixing.
be managed as a problem.
Yeah, yeah,
And it will often, I think, often say with topics like the social media ban, maybe even it's just taken for granted that we that young people are a group of people that we must protect and for
mm,
their own good. It's just all of that just gets kind of brought in without
yeah,
examination. Without examination, I guess that's what the figure of youth as a broad framing is doing, is saying, well, hang on, this isn't an objective thing. This is something that is constructed and is implicit of what we're doing with a lot of the time. Yeah.
yeah. That's right. It's yeah, it's very subjective. So,
Mm,
and I think, I mean, maybe one of the motivations when I started thinking about this is my own relationship to young people as well, right? Like, so you start off in our work where you're kind of maybe relatively closer to the age of students, for instance. And I suppose as you get older you relate to them less in terms of your own interests and your own references and pop culture or whatever. And as someone that's been very much sensitive to kind of moral panics about young people, particularly through about popular culture, as I get older, I inevitably start kind of maybe having some of those negative thoughts about young people myself. So I kind of catch myself doing it, even though I have this kind of, deep investment in youth sociology and youth studies, and I kind of understand it. So it's this thing that kind of happens.
mm,
Um, we're doing, we're kind of reckoning with at the moment with like the use of AI. Generations like, look at that stuff very differently, and so the meanings of these things are very
mm,
different, and they become normal for some people and less normal for the others.
yeah.
So yeah, in terms of space and time, that kind of relationship to young people changes. I've always been kind of found again, like when you're talking to other researchers, sometimes I start to wonder when's the last time they actually spoke to a young person.
Mm,
Often particularly people doing quantitative work.
yeah.
Um, so again, it's kind of a way to question our assumptions about what young people are, because yeah, as you just kind of pointed out, they tend to be positioned as something to be regulated, to be fixed, to be disciplined. Certainly not something to be listened to or as experts in their own lives. And
Mm.
you know, frankly, they are much more experts about contemporary things than many older people are.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, yeah, I think that's really clear in the way that young people are sort of, I guess, brought into being through the narratives we have around them. And I
Mm.
guess linking to previously in the course too, the position of young people that we take in the centre is this is why if there's, I guess this is in recognising that there are different figures of youth, that there's politics to this, right?
Yeah,
Because
and that being
otherwise
brought into being.
implicitly the politics is being done anyway.
Yeah, the brought into being thing is really important. So we can talk about what maybe youth is to a certain point objectively,
Mhm.
whether that's 15 to 25 or 15 to 28 in those official governmental categories. More
Ages, yep.
cons more conceptually, there's like that developmental stuff that like the likes of us can be sometimes critical about, but this kind of liminal space between being a child and adult. But then the specifics of that are very much brought into being through the different figurative usages of these
Mhm.
things in different parts of society, and particularly around how young people are governed, particularly around how they're exploited, and I would say particularly about how they're misrepresented and distorted in ways that like tends to be the extremes. You know, the
Mm.
young person in the media is more often not the really high achiever or the kind of, the risky person in the street taking drugs or getting drunk or jumping off something or driving a car too fast. Really, the most young people are somewhere in the middle of those things. And again, like most media representations, there's a kind of sensationalist, extreme representation of things that I think is
Mm.
problematic for the governing of young people in a good way. You know, we want good policy and stuff like that, but we
Mhm.
don't really get it when they're used and positioned in this way. So I
Yeah.
think the work that I was trying to do in this was to speak as much to policymakers and youth workers. Like it echoes here Peter Kelly's work about how experts are often a problem for the things they're an expert on. They're not
Mm.
necessarily making those people's lives better. They're regulating and then disciplining them. They're kind of bringing youth into being in these particularly political ways that I think, for the most part, isn't that great in terms of young people's flourishing or satisfaction or, being able to kind of have opportunities.
Mhm. Yeah. And in the next part, I think we'll talk more about the kind of cultural representations that we're dealing with, that I think is kind of where you began when you developed this concept. So we'll pick
Yeah.
that up in the next part, I think.
Yeah, and I think importantly, like I've mapped out some different figurative uses. I think there's five kind of opposing things in the paper, but like I'm not saying that's a complete picture. It's really
Mm.
important. I think there's others, and maybe it's a good exercise in the course in shoots for people to maybe think of some of their own.
Yeah.
But I think these are good places to start. They're kind of dominant ones. They'll evolve and be different over time.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Okay. Well, yeah, we'll pick it up in part two in a minute.
Thanks.
Thanks.